What is the X-factor stretch and how does it affect your club head speed? It is well evidenced that a larger X-factor stretch is associated with more club head speed potential. The X-factor stretch essentially tells us how we move our body to create some elastic energy and speed into the club head. For example, when we go into the backswing, in simple terms, we are stretching our body and our muscular system to create some of that elastic energy. So how we essentially, if we was to throw a ball, we stretch our body to unwind with a powerful motion. We simply wouldn't just stretch one part of the body like the arm and expect to be able to throw the ball a long way. This is no different in the golf swing. What we see with a lot of amateurs is that inability from a physical sense, whether that's mobility or strength, to be able to stretch their body in a manner that allows them to create that elastic energy. Whereas better movers are able to create a big stretch of the muscles, so a lengthening phase, to be able to then create that acceleration and that shortening motion to be able to create maximal club head speed at the ball in an efficient manner. Essentially, in order for us to create a large X-factor stretch, we need to move and coordinate our body in the correct sequence in the downswing. This means essentially separating our upper body from our lower body. So when we go into the backswing and create the transitional period into that downswing, we want to use a principle for the sequencing where we bring our proximal parts of our body, so these are the parts that are closest to our center, to our core, and those areas will move early. So this would be essentially the lead leg into the lead hip, into the trunk and the core area, and then more of those distal parts of the body, which would then start to be the elbow, the hand, and finally that club head. So we can get that sequencing from proximal into the lower half, into the trunk, into the hands, and then the last thing that comes is to the club head. So this is essentially a summation of speed principle where we're essentially using our bigger, more powerful muscles in a sequence fashion to drag the club along and get maximum speed at impact. So now you know what the X-factor stretch actually is. Most amateur golfers struggle both physically and technically from a coordination fashion to actually apply this motion. I'm going to give you some drills and some exercises to help improve this both physically and technically and increase your club head speed. The first exercise we're going to focus on is how to separate the lower body from the upper body. This can also serve as a little test in itself to see whether there's enough hip mobility, because you're going to need to have good range of motion to be able to effectively apply this. All I'm going to do is grab onto something roughly around chest height. You can use a door frame, something that's simple, but as long as you can be really stable through the upper body and core. You're going to take a golf posture roughly, so it doesn't have to be excessive. And what we're trying to do is feel like our shoulder line and our chest line doesn't move, and we can rotate the hips and the pelvis as far back and around as possible. If you do this and there's a lot of upper body turn, you're essentially not separating that upper body from that lower body. This takes coordination, some strength, and mobility in the hips to be able to do this effectively. Next, we're going to focus on separating the upper body from the lower body instead, but just like the lower body, this requires mobility and coordination, but more through the thoracic spine and trunk. You're simply going to take a golf club and put it across your shoulder line. Standing with your feet together and your knees together, applying a little bit of golf posture, keeping the knees together as tight as possible, you're going to try and rotate your torso or your chest as far as you can in each direction. What we're looking to achieve is these knees not separating and the hips not moving significantly. So there will be a little bit of hip movement, but we're trying to limit that. Whereas if we turn and we feel like we need to open up the hips or sway out, this is essentially a compensation. So we need to try and develop that to get that separation between the upper body and the lower body. Next, we're going to do an exercise that forces you to use some of that separation in a manner that is isometric. So essentially this means being able to create the movement in a held position, so there is no muscle movement, but we are trying to create the strength in that position. This will require a good baseline of strength and mobility, but at the same time, doing this exercise can improve those areas. You're going to take a set of suspension bands. You can use some strong resistance bands, but the whole purpose of this movement and exercise is to make sure there is no excessive motion, like a band can essentially stretch. So you're going to go into a golf posture, but trying to feel like your lead arm is almost in a turned position, a bit like a backswing position. I've got quite a lot of wide base here. You don't have to have a super wide base, but this just helps the feeling of pushing in and out the ground. So essentially, I can't move that any further. So I'm trying to get my left arm straight or my lead arm straight. And from there, I'm going to try and open up my lower body, so getting that hip separation and that feeling of opening up the lower body and the chest and the upper body. It's quite demanding this, so you will feel quite a bit of a stretch potentially in certain parts of the body. That's what we want. So I'm going to try and open up as hard as I can, hold for roughly 5 seconds. If you're quite used to training, 10 seconds would be better. But we're applying a lot of force here, so we don't want to be doing this excessively. And we can see how I'm separating that lower body, opening up, pushing it open, pulling hard with my upper body, but in essence, my upper body is staying back. So we are creating an X factor stretch position here. Those exercises have naturally tried to give you the feeling and the awareness as well as some mobility and strength in the movement. But now we need to learn to coordinate this into a more dynamic, athletic motion. The first exercise to help with this is going to be a rotational broad jump. Now, although this doesn't give quite the same upper body feeling, it certainly helps with the lower body of separating and getting that trunk staying in one direction and the lower body leading in the opposite direction. So what this looks like is if we take a squat setup, I'm going to rotate my body both around and down because I'm trying to load up like a jump as if I was going vertically. And then I'm going to try and push off and jump as far as I can in a 90-degree angle. So what we really need to focus on is really pushing hard into that trail hip, turning aggressively to get some sling and rotation, that elastic stretch as we talked about at the beginning, to be able to then push as explosive as possible. We've got to do this with real effort and intent. So there, and explode. So essentially I'm trying to get that spring from one side to the other and separate. Now we're going to take a medicine ball and put this into more of an explosive manner through the whole body. This exercise has actually been shown to have a very strong relationship between how the muscles stretch, that stretch shortening cycle in the X Factor and in the golf swing. You can throw this against something, but if you have enough space, you can just throw it as far as possible. But to begin with, I want you to really try and focus on being able to do the movement in that separated manner, and then you've got to do it as powerful as possible so you can get the muscles and the tendons and ligaments used to this explosiveness that we're looking for. So taking a golf posture, we're just trying to create that same sort of loading and stretching, and then the feeling of that sequence, so that proximal to distal, where the lead side moves first, we're then getting that push into the lead hip, turning the upper body and letting the hands and arms come in last. So there, stretch and throw. And we should be able to get that sequencing going in a manner that we want to be able to change how the body needs to be moving in the golf swing. So again, think of the jump, think of the separation, feel like the lead side goes first, and when we release the ball, it's being brought along as opposed to us trying to throw it. So that summation of speed. Finally, we're going to try and bring this all together in a bit more of a golf-specific manner. I want you to use a speed stick ideally, and I'm using a red one, which is the heaviest, which is 10% heavier than the typical driver. So if you don't have access to a speed stick, potentially something like a bit of lead tape that brings that driver up to no more than 10%, because we know above 10%, that slows the movement down in an ineffective manner that crosses over. What we're trying to do with this particular drill is doing a step-in motion, but I've got a cone down here. You can use something that gives you the same feel, and we're trying to almost imagine this is like a Coke can, and we're going to try and squash the Coke can first before letting the upper body turn. So if I kind of start my feet together, roughly, as I start to take this club away, I'm going to try and stand on the cone. So I'm going to try and squash the cone. And as we can see, what this is doing a sequence in my body. So my proximal has started to change direction already because of that pressure shift. But as I'm already taking the club back still, I'm now creating that stretch. So if we look closely, you'll see this X factor stretch begin and that separation and sequence. So then when we start to unwind in transition, the hands and arms are being brought through. The reason we're using a heavier club is because in order for us to coordinate this properly and get some speed on the heavier stick, we have to create more momentum. And we're going to create more momentum through more force. And to create more force, effectively, we need to use that proximal to distal principle, rather than if we've got a light stick or something light where we can just throw the hands and arms as quick as possible, which then essentially cheats the motion. So done in a more dynamic, explosive fashion, we're going to go back and turn as hard as possible. See how I've fully squashed that cone there? And that's what we're looking for because we want to see this done explosively. So my recommendation for applying these exercises into the technical, doing this as a routine will help you understand and coordinate a greater and larger X factor stretch, which then will increase your capacity for higher club head speed. Now that you understand what the X factor stretch is, it's important that you understand more about pressure shift. Make sure to watch this video next.